I'm gonna tell you a few things about perfecting local and remote Elixir CI pipeline. But just to give you an overview, short overview, I'm not gonna show you examples of YAML files or configurations on specific softwares like GitHub Actions or I don't know, something like Bodyworks, because there's a service called Bodyworks, for instance, for CI or Cl CI. I'm just gonna go through steps that I believe are pretty important to have in CI, and you'll be able to then see why a particular step is something that I consider as important thing in your CI. But first, why do we actually need continuous integration? Well, this is the last barrier where we can actually check if our quality guidelines are met. So if we, as a company, believe in some kind of a quality guidelines, then this is a step where we can do it in an automatic way. We make sure that the project actually builds, compile, because what's the purpose of deploying something to production if it doesn't build at all? We make sure that tests pass because, well, you don't want to deploy the broken project. So that's an obvious thing. And of course, and I consider this as a super nice thing. I would say even the most important for me, you spend less time on code review. What's the return over investment in spending the time on code review if you can automate some of the stuff? If the server can check for you this couple of steps that you consider as a must-have in every project. So CI is this place where you can just ask a server to check everything for you. You don't have to do it manually as a code reviewer. And I'm going to go through a list of operations in Elixir CI that I think should be a part of, if not all of the CIs, then most of the CIs. And these are the steps that I would personally put into the pipeline. So first of all, it's a very easy step. We have to, of course, fetch the dependencies. As you can see, there is a screenshot from this operation. It's called mix deps get. And why we need this? Well, we need it for the next steps because obviously the project cannot build, compile if it doesn't have the deps. Of course, there might not be any deps, but in most cases there are. And we actually assured ourselves that the deps that we need in the project are available because, of course, we fetch the dependencies from the remote server. Mostly, we can do it from the local, but mostly it's somewhere remote. So that's a pretty easy step, but then we go to a step which checks whether our project has a retired deps. So the command for it is mix hex.audit. As you can see in this case, I just created some kind of a sample repository before the presentation to verify all of these steps. In this case, there were no retired packages, but this mix hex audit will print out the retired packages if the maintainer of the library will note it as a retired with the mix hex.retire command. So it's the library that the maintainer of this library doesn't recommend to use anymore, the version of the library. So I would consider this as a pretty crucial step, but of course this step doesn't give you 100% assurance that that given version of the library is not retired, meaning if only the owner of the library will mark it as retired, then only this step will print it out as retired. Okay. So the next step would be finding unused dependencies, and this is a kind of an interesting command because I rarely see it in CIs, but it's very easy to do. So basically, you have to do mix deps.unlock, and you have to use a flag called check unused. And as you can see here, it prints out all of the unused dependencies that I had in mix.log file. So what it actually does is it's showing what's inside of the mix.log, but no longer in mix.exs. And your project will build these libraries, these deps, without any purpose because you're not using it anymore. So you don't want to compile, build a project, and download all of it if there is no use of it. So basically, that's what this step is checking. Then we go to Deps security audit. So everything that touches the security will happen here. And the command that you can use for this is mix deps.audit. And as you can see, it will just give you a name of the library, the version of the library that has some kind of a security vulnerabilities, and it's gonna point you to the issue that this problem refers to. So it's a task to scan mixed dependencies for security vulnerabilities. It draws its inspiration from tools like npm audit and bundler audit. You probably, if you did some JS-related work, you had a package JSON, you probably already know npm audit. It's a well-known thing. It will just print out all of the JS security issues, and there are always a bunch of these in every audit, I would say. And in this case, in case of this library, this is actually an external library. You have to add a lib to support this. You can just search in Google mix deps audit, and here is a link of a database of advisories that this library is based on. So it's on GitHub and depend about Elixir security advisories. And the problem here is that, as you can see, it doesn't have a huge list of libraries, and it was like updated seven months ago. So it's not a perfect tool. I'm just saying that you cannot expect here that it's such a great thing like it's in the case of npm audit. The community here is still too small to say that it's like a similar tool in terms of popularity. But what I found out like 2 weeks ago is that GitHub has announced that they are supporting now Elixir and Erlang in GitHub advisory repository. So if you can go to github.com/advisories, you will see a list of languages where they store some advisories for the security reasons, and it's maintained by open source community. It's still based on what the developers in this open source community post, but well, if you use GitHub, then you can use it as something, as a replacement to it. Maybe this can be integrated to other services like GitLab or Bitbucket, but I'm not sure. So you will have to check this out. But this is like an alternative to what I just showed to you, which was a mixed deps audit. And as you can see here, there are like 18 advisories so far in Erlang, but the most recent one is from the May. So it's more recent than it was in terms of mixed deps audit. This is actually also something that we should take into account as developers to support the development of this database, because the more we engage in it, the safer our code gets. Then a very important tool from my perspective, checking code formatting. So this is like a simple command. For most of you, I guess this is a well-known thing to format projects. And you can format the whole project with a mix format. But if you give it two additional options, then here is what happens. It will check if mix format returns a proper status code with check formatted, meaning if your code is not formatted, then the CI pipeline will not succeed. Also, the option which is called dry run will assure that no saves will be made to the files, so that in the process of checking, no saves to the files. So it's like a command to check whether your code is formatted. And if only there is at least one place where it's not formatted, it's going to fail in terms of failing the CI process. And why I would say we need to use mix formatter, I would say this is a unification of code style. And more importantly, you don't have any discussions about how your code should look like in code reviews, because I would say this is like a very popular topic before any formatted arrived. In PRs, people are arguing whether you should indent your code like this or like that. I would say it's a waste of time. You can spend it on doing something more productive, actually developing the product rather than just arguing on how to indent the code. So in these terms, mix formatter is really important tool for me. And last thing, well, your code looks nicer because although we all have like our own styling in mind, we tend to forget to style a given line of code, and then it's always, I would say it, a mix of different ideas on how you should style the code. Mix formatter does a unification of code styling, and that's great from my perspective. Then the sixth step is compiling the code. Well, you cannot push the app if it doesn't compile, but you can, for instance, ask me why did I do all of these Deps-related steps before compiling the code? Well, I think that if you can get the information faster that something is failing, then that's a huge win. Compiling the code takes some time. If it's big, then it may take really even a couple of minutes. With these commands that I showed to you related to Deps, you don't have some of these. You don't have to even with some of these you don't even have to compile the code. So you can see that there is some kind of a problems with your Deps before the compilation happens. So from my perspective, it's better to do these steps with Deps before the compilation hits. And this is where the compilation happens. And as you can see, I've added some flags to it, some options. And as you can see in this case, there was a one warning saying that I have an unused alias called router. Now, with these flags, what will happen? All warnings will print every warning that is within the project, even if the given module where the warning happens doesn't have to be recompiled. And warning as errors will treat every possible warning as something that stops compiling the project because it's treated as an error, so that your project will not compile with warning. From my perspective, warnings are, I would say, a pretty nice ideas on how to improve the code. Sometimes it's even information that something may break. So I would say this is a flag that every project should have, because you don't want to push your project with warnings. And the all warnings flag will not make any use in terms of CI, remote CI, because eventually you have to compile the whole project. But if you put it into some local CI, then it already can be a nice thing. So there is also an alternative way to enable this warning as an error option. And as you can see in the dev project function, inside of mix.exs, you can add this Elixir RC options with warnings as error true, which will, the result of it will be like this. Whenever you're going to compile the code, recompile the code locally, if there is going to be a warning, it's not going to compile. So it's like also affecting your local development. Not only the CI, but also local development. It has some drawbacks. Sometimes you actually don't want to, I don't know, omit some variables just because there is a warning and you cannot compile the code. But it's a kind of an assurance that at any stage of development, there will be no warnings. So it's up to you. From my perspective, it's a nice option. Then, of course, if you don't have any DB in your project, then you don't need it. But if you do, and that's like most of the cases, I think, you will verify the DB migration's ability to fully roll back. So let me give you an example of a migration that can't be rolled back. So it's a dummy example, but I had to have something to show you. In the app function in this migration, we create a table called users, and in the down, which is supposed to be the one that is called on rollback, we also create a table of users. Of course, we should drop this table, not create, but this is an example that shows you that it can be migrated, but it can be rolled back. And if you run this command, which is first creating a DB, then calling migration with ecto-migrate, and then doing the full rollback, which is done with mix ecto rollback with option all, you'll see that there is a problem with this migration. Why do we need this all flag? Because if you just call mix ecto rollback, it will roll back the most recent migration. If you're gonna give an all flag, it's gonna roll back all of the migrations. So you want to migrate everything and then roll back. And of course, if any of the migrations were defined in a bad way, it's gonna fail, and the CI process is gonna fail, then you will have a red CI. Why it's important? Because you don't want to push a code to production that eventually can't roll back the DB. If it's gonna be a pretty crucial thing, like, I don't know, something affecting your whole system, and a simple rollback would do the thing, will fix the problem, your server would work normally, then it would be great. But if it can't, then you have to quickly find a way to somehow fix this problem. So from my perspective, a great step, it's going to assure you that your DB migrations are defined in a good way. All right. Next thing, it's a static code analysis with Credo. And there is a series of couple of steps here where we're going to do a static code analysis. The first one is Credo. And this is the type of information that you get with Credo and a flag called strict. As you can see, there are a couple of categories where Credo checks whether your code is in good shape. For instance, here we can see code readability, software design. There are a couple of these, and you can configure it in a special configuration file. Credo is, of course, an external dependency, so you have to install it first. But as a short version of description taken from the README, it searches for refactoring opportunities, complex code fragments, spotting common mistakes, showing inconsistencies in your naming scheme. You can even enable an option to have the aliases in an alphabetic order. So there are a lot of different options. You can disable, enable each of the options. It's up to you and your team to decide whether you want it or not. And the strict option, as you can see here, adds low priority suggestions to failing case. So Credo have this kind of assigning some kind of priorities to the things it lists, and some of these are low priority, and they are not treated as a failing case scenario. I like to add this flag here because, from my perspective, I want to have my code 100% good quality. So I always add the strict flag as well. But again, up to you and your team whether you would like to have it or not. Next, so the previous one was like, let's say, quality of the code, static analysis. And now we go to security-focused analysis. And the library that allows you to do it is Sobelow, and you can install it as it's an external dependency, so you have to install it in your project. And here is an example of failing case scenario with Sobelow, which shows to you, for example, that HTTPS is not enabled in your project. So, as I said, it performs a security-oriented static analysis of your code. And there are a couple of examples taken from documentation that you can spot with this tool. It's insecure configuration, known vulnerable dependencies, cross-site scripting, SQL injections, etc., etc. You can see all of them here. So I would say this is the best tool in terms of security scanning, static code analysis. I would say it's a must to include it in your project. Then we go to the 10th step, which is a static code analysis with Dialyzer and Dialyxir. So Dialyzer is also an external dependency. You have to install it. And what it does is it actually checks most of the things that are interested here is the type checking. You can see a failing case scenario here. It generates a file called PLT. I'm gonna give you the full version of the name soon, but you can see here that, for instance, in the page controller, there's some kind of a problem with success typing in the index function. So the mixed dialyzer compiles the projects and creates the PLT persistent lookup table with dependencies if needed and runs Dialyzer. PLT is a data structure that contains inferred and user annotated type signatures. So even if you don't have a user annotated type in your project, so you do it with spec, Dialyzer is still useful tool because it tries to predict whether there are some kind of a type mismatches in your project based on what you have. So even if you don't have any type, even if you don't have any specs in your project, it's still something that you can consider adding to your project. And of course, Dialyzer fails whenever there is a type mismatch in the project. First run of the Dialyzer takes some time, just saying, because it may, at first, it may be something that you're trying to ask yourself, is it actually running, or did it, like, I don't know, broke the project and cannot get out of the loop? It takes some time to generate the PLT file, but once it's generated, then you can just, on the next run, see the much improvement in the time spent on the analysis, because it just analyzes what changed. And there is an alternative. It's called Gradient. And Dialyxir is as a library that you can use to add Dialyzer to your project in Elixir. And Gradient is a tool that adds support for gradualizer in your project. But what's different between these tools is that gradualizer doesn't do type inference. So it's actually not really useful if you don't have a type specs in your project. But if you do have a type specs in your project, it will statically check for errors, even beyond what Dialyzer would be able to detect or would acknowledge. So it's like more strict in these terms. From my perspective, Dialyzer is still better. I wouldn't say that Dialyzer is the best tool in the world, because sometimes you just cannot figure out what it's trying to tell you. But with Gradient, I saw even more cases where I was like not really understanding what it's saying. And sometimes it says that it's not sure about the problem listed in this. Maybe it's because it's like strict in the rules. It's more trying to dig into what could have happened wrong with the specs. I would still use Dialyzer instead of Gradient, but you may want to take a look at it because it may be more useful for you. At some point, maybe even I will be more interested in this tool. It's still in development, so we'll see. And of course, I have to mention that on the last Elixir Conf EU, Jose had a keynote where he was talking about the typing system in Elixir. And he was talking about the things that are mostly raised in the Elixir community as advantages of adding typing system to Elixir. But he believes that some set of these advantages are actually advantages. Some of these are not really something that he considers as valuable in terms of creating this whole typing system. But there is, he announced that there is a research in these terms. So maybe, because he also said that maybe we will have something soon, but it can also take months, it can take years, or it can even stop at the point where they're gonna say, okay, it's enough, we cannot figure out a good solution to this. He was talking mostly about the set-theoretic types. There is a YouTube video where you can check this out. You can use this short link that I inserted here if you're interested. But why I'm adding this here, because if there's gonna be this new typing, maybe not new, but just a typing system that we can use in Elixir, then it can be actually something better than Dialyzer, and that would be great. Okay, then we move on to the step verifying documentation coverage. So I know that there are different approaches to documenting the project. So treat this tool as something that should be added to your project, but in a way that you actually want to have this work. And it's called Mix Doctor. It's also an external dependency. And what you can see here is that it's verifying whether your modules have docs in the functions. It has some kind of a module-wide documentation, module doc, whether it has specs, etc. So why it's actually pretty cool, because you can, for instance, set some rules behind what's the coverage for the specs in your project, expected coverage of the specs in your project, but not necessarily, for instance, you have to insist on having, I don't know, 100% of documentation on the functions. So Mix Doctor ensures that your documentation is healthy in the project. And of course, it provides a mixed task to run against your project to generate a documentation coverage report. And it's configurable via .exs file. And this is this file. And I think this is actually pretty nice thing, because I personally insist on having the functions that are well named, and the arguments of these functions are well named. So if the function is, for instance, named find user by ID, and the only argument that it takes is ID, then I know that this function will return a user by ID. That's like obvious for me. I don't need a documentation for that. I'm okay with it. But there are like more complex functions where you actually need to add some sort of documentation. And then you can use this doc. That's at least my approach. But for instance, if you want to really make some good use of Dialyzer, then adding specs to all of the functions you have in the projects is really a good idea. Also, specs shows you what type of arguments are coming into the functions and what type of returned value is expected. So based on the name of the function, name of the arguments, and the specs, you can actually understand the whole function pretty well. With Doctor, you can actually set the minimum coverage of the specs. So you can assure that within the project, you have like a high percentage of coverage of the specs. But if you insist on adding docs, you can also do it. So for me, it's a very, it's also a very nice thing to have. Dimitri just posted Credo. Yes, this is the tool I was mentioning in one of the steps. That also it's a must in a CI from my perspective. But thank you for posting the link so everyone can also go to this GitHub page. So Doctor would be yet another external dependency in your project that does a static analysis of your Elixir code. And then, of course, we need to run tests. It's a totally known step. This is a very positive screenshot because all of them succeeded. As I said, I used some kind of I just generated a new Phoenix project to just give you some sort of screenshots here. But just not to say to you that you should run tests and that's it, which is the first point here, but there is also an option within the mix-exs project function where you can set the test coverage tool, meaning you can analyze your whole project in terms of the coverage of the tests. Now, in order to do that, you have to pass a module that will analyze this project. So this is where this tool option comes in place. And as an example, if you want to, for example, use one of these already created nice modules that will help you generate this report, you can use xcoveralls, for instance, which is noted in this third point here. I use it personally, and for instance, you can set that your project should have a minimum of 90% of coverage of the tests. And this is gonna be yet another step in CI, because you can run this mixed test with an option that will take coverage into account. So if the coverage configuration file will say, okay, you have to have 90% of the test in terms of coverage, then CI will not succeed if there is not going to be 90% of the coverage. So it's a nice option, also yet another step to assure that your project is in a good shape. Okay, then we have some kind of remote CI tips. I thought about including some of the remote CI tips, but as I said, I'm not going to show to you some, I don't know, GitHub action configuration or something like this. Just a couple of things that are taken from my experience. Well, of course, in CI and remote, you have to set up all of the dependencies first. And what I mean by that is, of course, running the mix deps get so that you have all of the deps in the project, setting up the PostgreSQL, setting up the Redis, all of the things that your project needs. And very important thing, use a cache, because you don't want to waste the precious CI time on things that are not really needed. So as I said, Dialyzer PLT file, it takes a lot of time to create it, really a lot of time, even more than a build, I think. So you can cache it, and only the things that will change regarding the cache will be added to this file. And then you can cache it again and again, so that the step will actually not take a lot of time. So it's important to actually cache it. Also build folder, and of course Deps, because you can also cache Deps. Third thing, whenever possible, use parallelism, because you can. Just one thing here, what can't we run in parallel? Steps that rely on each other, like compile and test. You have to have compiled project to run the tests, because if not, then what we test actually. So you can't make these steps in parallel. You have to take a look at your pipeline and decide on what things should run first, then what things should run next, and think through what type of things can be put in parallel. For instance, Credo, Dialyzer, Sobelow can be run in parallel. So this is the third tip. And the fourth tip is that you should, of course, use the same lib versions as stated in the main branch, so that there is a consistency between what you actually test in CI and what you run in the local. But the topic of this presentation was perfecting local and remote CI, Elixir CI pipeline. So there is also a local aspect to it. This is the type of a topic that people sometimes argue on. Some people will say that you should use a local CI in the project. Sometimes you'll hear that keep it on the remote part and don't do local at all. From my perspective, it's also something that you and your team should agree on. From my perspective, it's a nice to have thing. So if you see a value in it, then do it. And I'm gonna just go through a couple of steps on how you can do it in Elixir. So first of all, you can do it with Git hooks. Sorry. So this is not something Elixir related. It's just a normal Git thing. And there are just a couple of easy steps on how you can do it. First of all, you should copy a sample pre-commit hook, because in every Git project, you will see that there are a lot of sample files generated for you in hooks folder. In .git/hooks folder, there are a lot of sample files generated for you by Git. What you have to do is copy this sample file and create a version without this .sample. For instance, you can do it for the pre-commit sample, and you have to add executable permissions to it, just like it's presented in here. Then you have to, of course, add some logic to this file so that it actually checks something. And this is an example of the pre-commit file, where, of course, you have to specify what's your shell. In this case, it can be bash. But then you specify a list of commands that should run. It should return a proper status code in order for this pipeline to succeed. In this case, as you can see, I just did two simple steps. I use a mix format with check formatted flag to check whether my project is formatted, and I ran a mix Credo. So the third step would be to try to run a git commit. It's a pre-commit hook, so it's gonna run before the commit. So it should, the commit should succeed only if this pipeline, let's say pipeline, will succeed in the pre-commit git hook file. And here is an example. I just committed something dummy. I specifically add one space to make the formatter fail. And as you can see, there is an information on failing file. And this commit didn't succeed, meaning there's no commit created in git log. So this is a very easy step that you can do to create a local CI pipeline. And let me come back to maybe this step. As you can see, it's not only pre-commit, it can be pre-push, for instance. So you don't have to run it before commit, you can run it before pushing. But I think the most valuable one in these terms is pre-commit one. And what are the advantages of using this approach? It's easy to configure. As you could see, there are like very easy steps to do it. And it's a per user configuration. So if your team doesn't accept any local CIs, any stuff like this, you can do it on your own. Just not to forget to format the code, for instance. Actually, formatting the code can be integrated with the code editor, but still, for some reason, you maybe can do it, or you can just add Credo step here, for instance. So if you want, you can add it. You don't have to ask anybody to allow you to do it. And it doesn't enforce running local CI, right? Because this hooks folder is not submitted to remote repository. You don't push it to GitHub, to Bitbucket, GitLab. You don't push it anywhere. It's only yours. And you can put whatever you want here. So regarding on what's valuable or not for you, you can put just formatting step, for instance, here. And there are some disadvantages of using this approach. And as you can see, I'm gonna just step back. As you can see, I said that you don't have to sync with the team, and that's an advantage. And I said that it doesn't enforce you to run a local CI, and that's an advantage. And I think in some way this is both advantage and disadvantage, because if you don't want to have junk code in your GitHub, for instance, you need some kind of assurance from your team members that they are not gonna do it. So if there's the only way to do it is to enforce them to run this local CI. And you cannot do it with Git hooks just like that. As I said, you cannot push it to the repo, so there's no way to sync it with repo. So I would say that for some of the people, it's going to be both advantage as well as disadvantage. It's up to you whether you want to use it or not. But I also have some kind of solution to it, which is based on external library that will allow you to actually integrate this in a way that these things listed here are going to work. And it's called Git hooks. As I said, it's an external library. So first, of course, you have to install it. And as you can see, in the README, you will see that the most recent version is 0.7.0. But for some reason, it doesn't work for me great. And I know that 0.6.5 seems to be stable. It works. So just off topic, just take a look at what's working for you and why it doesn't work at the most recent branch. Maybe they already fixed it, but it works on 0.6.5. And you have to configure it. It's also taken from the README. There is one error here in the tasks. I should have given, there is an error in comment in mixed format. It will not compile, but it doesn't matter. It's just an example. So when you configure Git hooks, I would say the first option is very important because, as you will see in the moment, auto install will actually install the hooks in the project where you're running this. If you're not gonna do true here, you will have to manually generate the hooks. You can run it against specific branches. You can whitelist, blacklist these branches. And in the hooks option, here comes the party. So you specify all of the hooks that you would like to generate. as well as the tasks that should be put inside of it. I'm saying here that I would like to have my project checked in terms of formatting, as well as I would like to run mix Credo strict. So when you compile the project with this dependency, you will see that when it compiles the Git hooks library, it's installing the Git hooks. As you can see, it installed some Git hooks. And if you try to run your commit, you will see that it's running a Git hooks, especially, and in this case, pre-commit hook. If you have more, then it's of course going to run all of these. And it's saying that it failed on mix format check formatted. So the commit didn't succeed. What this library is doing is that it generates the hook in Git hooks folder for you based on the configuration you have in the file. And if you enable the auto install option, it will install it whenever you compile the project. So all of your team members, when they're going to compile the project, they will have these hooks. Of course, then they can do something with it, like, I don't know, remove what's in there. And the local CI will not work for them then. But then again, when they're going to compile the whole project yet again, it's going to reappear. So it's the best what we can do, at least from what I researched, to ensure that your whole team is synced in terms of the local CI. And I think this is the last slide here. So what I would like to just say is that I like the approach in CI where I put as much as possible steps to automate checks for the projects, not only for the quality of code, but security, in terms of testing, etc., etc. And if I could put more steps to this whole list, I would do it definitely. If only I see a value in given step, I do it. So don't treat it as a list that should not grow, because if you have more steps, then of course you can add something to it. If you don't consider a given step as valuable, you can remove it. I would love to hear from you in comments whether you maybe have more steps that you use in project that you consider as a must-have or as something that is a nice to have. Because as I said, I like to automate stuff and put as much in CI as possible. And regarding the local CI thing, I even saw, like, I don't know, 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, a thread in Elixir forum where there was a question regarding local CI. And I could see that that the community is biased between whether to use it or not. I think even Chris McCord said that, I'm sorry if I'm mistaken, but I think he said that it's not a good idea. But I would say this is up to you. It's your local thing. If you want to run it, then do it. If you don't want to run it, then don't. I know that if you have a bigger project, running a local CI may take some time. So before it commits, it may be like, I don't know, 3 minutes. And you cannot put everything into your local CI, because you don't want to put a step where you roll back the whole DB to check whether the migrations are defined in proper way. So you have to be ready to define the proper steps in local CI, whereas at the remote version of it, you can do whatever you want, and that's just my opinion. Yeah, and basically that's it. That's it for today when it comes to my presentation.